I hope that you had a very productive first day. Now we can relax and learn about Japan's relation to China. And it was a great pleasure that I can introduce you to Professor Akio Takahara, one of our esteemed keynote speakers at NAJS. Tomorrow we will have Professor Manami Hori, but today we have pleasure to have Takahara Sensei. And he's a distinguished visiting professor at the Tokyo Women's Christian University, and currently a MERICS Fellow at the Mercator Institute for China Studies in Berlin. Takahara is one of the leading scholars of China and Japan, and he has published numerous very influential articles, and his productivity is particularly impressive because, well, considering his very high-level positions, just to name a few, former dean of the Graduate School of Public Diplomacy of the University of Tokyo from 2018 to 20, and executive director of the JICA Ogata Sadako Research Institute for Peace and Development from 2020 and 2023. So as far as I know, you're retired and you're committed now fully to your academic career back again. So one of his newest publications includes an edited volume with some colleagues on Japan's-China's relation from 2001 to 2022. It's Nichichiu Kanke 2001 to 2022, published at the University of Tokyo Press last year, and it collects an impressive amount of 17 chapters analyzing 2 decades of Japan-China's relation since 2001. From different angles, including politics, diplomacy, economic, and society. And today, Takahara Sensei will talk about Japan-China's relation. How does Japan cope with the rise of China? And I think this is a particularly interesting topic for us in Scandinavia, Europe, and beyond, because it is only recently, I think, that we in Europe or the West realized the post-Cold War geopolitical tension. And I think this is something that Japan has been already dealing with quite some years, and I think there's quite a lot of things that we can learn from. And well, the main question is, of course, that we are also now faced in light of the Ukraine war, how to live next to a country that is a competitor of even a threat. Yeah? So, and I'm convinced that we can learn quite a lot from the case of Japan. In that sense, thank you very much for having this presentation today. It will be about 45 minutes, and after that we will have Q&A and a little reception after we finish the official part here. So without further ado, Professor Takahara, please, the floor is yours. Thank you. Just gonna... There we go. Thank you.
Well, it's been a long day for many people, and I know that I'm now standing in between you and some drinks. But first of all, of course, thank you so much for inviting me here today. My thanks go to the Nordic Association for Japanese Studies. I really enjoyed your discussions today from morning to afternoon. I really wanted to take part in a lot of the discussions, but I hadn't read any of your papers. I'm very sorry about that. I feel sorry to myself. So I felt I was not qualified to speak. But now I have a chance to speak for 45 minutes. But I'll try to be brief so that you won't fall asleep, and so that we can enjoy an exchange of views about this very difficult topic, China. Raymond just said, and thanks to Raymond for inviting me here. It's been wonderful to come to know you and to be able to come to Aarhus at this wonderful season of the year. And I had my umbrella today prepared, so no worries about the rain as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, Raymond just said that perhaps the Nordic countries can learn from Japan. I'm not pretty sure about that, but we can share our agony. Japan has had a lot of difficulties in dealing with China. Professor Komiyama, who used to be the president of the University of Tokyo, he invented this phrase that Japan is an advanced country in meeting new challenges, yes? and the rise of China, how we deal with the rise of China actually has been one of those questions that we have had to deal with a lot earlier than other countries perhaps. But without further ado, let's just dive into my talk because there's not much time if this moves forward for me.
Does it? Hope so.
How can I move this forward? Oops.
Yeah, here we go. I think just pressing.
Okay. Thank you very much. So you know the basic problem, what I would call the China dilemma. China's rise has been good for many countries, including Japan, especially economically, but militarily we are gravely troubled, as you know, and I call it action first-ism. But ever since China has had the capacity, the capability to act, China has been prone to act and let diplomacy take care of the rest. So it's action first, diplomacy second. The Chinese Communist Party believes in power, they believe in money, they think they are more powerful, they are much richer than other countries, and so therefore a bit of a friction overseas is no problem for them. They would think that, well, eventually they will come back to us, even though they may have grudges, because they cannot avoid our power and they cannot avoid our market. That's the basic attitude, very problematic to many countries. Okay? All right, so this is one of the examples of what the Chinese have been doing to Japan. It's already 12 years ago now, time flies, but in September 2012, when the Noda cabinet, the Japanese government then, decided to purchase the Senkaku Islands, some of the Senkaku Islands from a private owner, private landlord, the Chinese reacted so violently and the authorities did not stop these mobs from looting or arson, what have you. And it's estimated that about 10 billion Japanese yen worth of damage was done. So you can understand that in Japan, the image of China has been pretty bad, especially since we have had this problem over the Senkakus. Move, please. Yeah. So you know where the Senkakus are. You are all experts on Japan and China, so I'm going to skip this. And you know that there are different narratives about the Senkaku Islands. According to the Chinese, they had always belonged to China, however you define China. It's a very difficult question. But anyway, and the islands were stolen from China, which was Qin dynasty then, when the Japanese and the Qin dynasty were fighting a war. And they say that it's not part of Okinawa, but it's part of Taiwan. Therefore, when World War II ended, the islands should have been returned to China, which was the Republic of China at that time. And that's the narrative. However, in Japan, it's very different, as you know. The Senkaku Islands belong to nobody, and therefore the Japanese government then in 1895 announced that it's going to be ours, and no one made any opposition to that. So the Qin dynasty, the Republic of China, even the People's Republic of China only started to claim sovereignty over the Diaoyuda, what they call the Diaoyuda, or what we call the Senkaku Islands, in December 1971. Actually, the Republic of China, the government in Taiwan, started to claim sovereignty a little earlier than that, earlier in 1971. And as you know, we normalized our relations with the PRC in 1972. So what should we do with the Senkaku Islands? If we were not able to decide our territories, you know, where the demarcation line is going to be, how are we going to sign a peace treaty ending the war formally with China? So this was a big question. And at that time, if you remember, there was an opposition party leader called Mr. Takeiri of the Komei Party, which is now part of the government. But at that time, he was in the opposition side, on the opposition side, and he visited Beijing, met Zhou Enlai, who was the prime minister, and discussed what could be the conditions for normalization of relations between Japan and China. And Takahara thought he had to raise the Senkaku issue because it was a few months earlier, in December 1971, that China started to claim sovereignty. So Takahara asked Zhou Enlai, "What do you think about the Senkakus?" And Zhou Enlai said, "Mr. Takahara, are you interested in this issue? I'm not. Because of oil, some historians started to make a fuss in China. And in Japan, there is a Professor Inoue who is also making a fuss about it. But I'm not interested in it. Let's not talk about it." And Takahara accepted that view. Why did the historians started to make a fuss, and what was it about oil? Because in the late 1960s, one UN organization conducted some survey on the seabeds around the Senkakus, and the report said, as a conclusion, that there is a possibility of a huge oil hidden or lying around the Senkaku Islands. And you remember the 1970s, it was the days of the oil crisis. Well, the oil crisis happened a little later, but people were focusing on the strategic resources that was oil. And Zhou Enlai made it clear it was because of this that we started to make a claim over the what they call the Diaoyuda. All right, but both sides agreed that once we started to discuss this issue, neither side would be able to make any concessions, right? Once you have started to claim, then you cannot just suddenly say, okay, you're right, we were wrong, so we're not going to claim it anymore. The Beijing government would not be able to do that. So the tacit understanding, in my wording, the tacit understanding was that neither side will touch on the issue. The islands had always been administered by the Japanese since 1895. At one point of time, more than 200 people lived on the island of Uotsugi, which is the biggest island of the Senkaku Islands. This happened before the war. And after the war, nobody was living on the islands, but they were still owned by a private landlord, 3 of them, first 4 of them. And when the Noda government decided to buy them, one is still left in the hand of a private landlord, but the 4 of the 5 major islands started to be owned by the government. I shouldn't take too much time explaining these things because it's only 45 minutes. And the next point is, around the friction or the confrontation, really, between Japan and China in the past 14 years or so, there are huge perception gaps between the Japanese and the Chinese. According to the Chinese, the provocation came from Japan. Japan turned very hardline, so there was no other way but for us to react very hard against that. That's the basic point that the Chinese are making. When in 2010, in September, there was a collision between the Chinese trawler and the 2 Japanese Coast Guard vessels, the Japanese government, according to the Chinese, the Japanese government used internal law for the first time to arrest the captain. This is actually not correct, but anyway, that was a narrative that was presented by the Chinese. This is unacceptable, totally. And 2 years later, then Tokyo Governor Ishihara suddenly announced that, well, the central government, the Noda government, is not doing enough to protect the islands from the Chinese, so I'm going to do it. The Tokyo metropolitan government would purchase the islands from the private landlord, and we will send policemen there, we will build a small port there, and defend the islands better. The Noda government, as you know, according to the Japanese system of governance, cannot order Governor Ishihara to stop. So the only way they could think of to prevent a crisis was to purchase the islands by themselves, and that's what happened. And the Japanese media called it nationalization. But for many Chinese, this was completely unacceptable because their image of nationalizing a remote island means that the Japanese moved in there with force and occupied the place, which belonged to us. And they reacted very violently, as you saw in the photos that I showed you. But according to the Japanese, of course, Noda had no other way to handle that problem. But the Chinese do not accept this explanation, saying that no, Ishihara and Noda had been colluding from the beginning. So it was all a kabuki show. So the Japanese have changed their attitude. They have started to move, betraying the promise that neither side will touch on the issue. And in December 2012, Prime Minister Abe formed his second cabinet, and you know how the Japanese defense policies have been changing. So according to China, it's Japan that changed the policy, that changed the attitude, so we have to react against that. But, and this is a very interesting drawing by an artist, I suppose, that appeared, that was distributed by Xinhua news agency one day after the trawler collision incident. So you can see that according to the Chinese, it was the Japanese Coast Guard vessels that rammed into the belly of a small Chinese trawler, not only once, but twice. And many, many Chinese newspapers carried this drawing. But it's a bit odd, isn't it? I mean, on what grounds did they draw this drawing? No Chinese was around the scene at that time. Not only the captain, but all the crew was still detained. So, we had a big question mark above our head. Okay, how did they, on what basis did they draw this picture? And the Japanese views are completely the opposite. The recent incidents in 2010, 2012, these are only what happened in recent years, but the Chinese move started a lot earlier. In 1992, they introduced a new law on the territorial sea and the contiguous zone, and in that, the name Diaoyudao was included as a part of the Chinese territory. In fact, the draft of this law, which was drafted by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China, did not have the name Diaoyudao. It only said islands affiliated to Taiwan. But when the draft was sent around for comments, a lot of the military units and also even civilian units such as the Guangdong government sent their views, opinions that the name Diaoyudao should be put in. And finally, eventually, the name was actually included. And the Japanese were shocked. What? The Chinese have started to touch on the issue. And they protested, but the Chinese did not stop their movements or actions, and they started to send their research vessels first. And there was an agreement in 2001 that if you wanted to send your research vessels, you have to tell the other side first, if you wanted to go into some designated areas. But the Chinese did not abide by this agreement. That's the view on the Japanese side. And there were many, many incidents from the Japanese point of view, were very disturbing. Activists landed on Uotsurijima, that's the biggest island of the Senkakus, in the spring of 2004. And of course, they were arrested according to Japanese law. But it was the immigration law that was adopted at that time, that was applied at that time, and they were sent back forcefully. But in that same year, Chinese nuclear submarine intruded into the Japanese territorial waters, not around the Senkakus, but around Miyako, without surfacing. That's against international law. And what's important, but not many people have paid attention to, is the fact that in 2006, then China State Oceanic Administration introduced a new policy, a new system for regularly patrolling their interests in the East China Sea. So most likely, according to this new policy, 2 years later, in December 2008, Chinese Coast Guard vessels entered into our territorial waters, what the Japanese would say, our territorial waters around the Senkakus, in order to claim sovereignty for the first time. That was in December 2008. So from the Japanese point of view, you can understand it's a trend. And the Chinese, according to the increase in their capacities, in their capabilities, they have started to do things that they were not able to do in the past. And maybe some of you have already seen this YouTube video clip that was leaked by somebody who used to work for the Japanese Coast Guards. And you can see, if you go to this website, it's still there very clearly that, How can I go backwards? Nope. Whatever I do, it goes forward. It's a very forward-moving. Maybe
This one?
go back a bit more.
More back?
Oh yes, of course, of course.
Yeah,
Now I know. Yeah, thank you, thank you. Yes, so certainly this is not what happened. So this is a complete political fabrication. So this is what the Chinese media do at time and then, but anyhow. All right, however, under Abe's leadership, Japan-China relations gradually improved, yeah, if you remember. And in May 2018, Li Keqiang, then Prime Minister, came to Japan for an official visit. And October that year, Abe made an official visit to Beijing, a very successful one. I won't go into the details. But in 2019, Xi Jinping came to Japan. Do you remember that? There was a G20 summit meeting in Osaka. So Xi Jinping did not come to Tokyo, but he did go to Osaka, and Abe gave a special treatment to him. You know, there were 20 other heads of state and heads of the EU and so on and so forth, but especially for Xi Jinping, Abe gave a banquet. And December 2019, Abe visited China once again for the trilateral meeting. So in April 2020, Xi Jinping was supposed to come to Japan. It was already decided between the two governments, but then that visit was postponed, partly because of COVID, but partly because the atmosphere between the two countries deteriorated. Why? Because there was a lot of troubles that arose since 2019. The increase in China's Coast Guard vessels coming, Hong Kong was big. You know, many Japanese have been to Hong Kong. Many Japanese have lived in Hong Kong. So looking at what was going on in Hong Kong in 2019 and 2020 was really, really heartbreaking for many Japanese people. And there was the Uyghur re-education incident, and that had started earlier, but still attracted a lot of attention. And then the COVID came in 2020. Biden came to power, but still with a tough stance against China. And unlike Trump, Biden wanted to face China more closely with his allies. Yeah. And there was the Fukushima nuclear power plant treated water release incident. This is more recent, especially since last year. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has been hysterical in calling it contaminated water, and they have banned the import of all the Japanese fishery products. You know, China had been and still is one of the rare countries that's not import. After the Fukushima nuclear power plant incident, some countries stopped importing Japanese fish from certain parts of Japan, but now they're all cleared, except for China, and some part of the fish still not allowed in Taiwan. But anyway, China has not lifted this ban all the time, but now all the fishery products, including carp, carp has nothing to do with the sea. It's all bred in ponds and things, but they do not import that. So why are they doing this? They think it's a way to exert pressure on Japan. Another question is the final line. The question of the international status of Okinawa has been revisited by the Chinese. It's very interesting. The Chinese Foreign Ministry does not mention this at all. They know that it's a no-go issue. There's no possibility that the international status of Okinawa will be revisited. But people who are in the system under the Central Propaganda Department, like the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, Japan Institute, all those people do not call Okinawa Okinawa anymore, or they call it Ryukyu, which is a very serious challenge to the post-World War II international order in our part of the world. So all these troubles have arisen. So how is the state of Japan-China relations today? I have a very simple analytical framework, as it were. I think it's very important to have a comprehensive, total view about the relationship. Otherwise, we can easily misunderstand the state of our relations. So I tend to think that we can categorize the factors that play roles in defining Japan-China relations into 4 categories. Domestic politics in the 2 countries, of course, this is very important. You know, diplomacy is an extension of domestic politics, right? It's very true in Japan-China relations too. Economic interests, of course. You know, to think of it, it's very difficult to define Japan-China relations. It's very difficult actually to define any bilateral relations. If you want to define it very narrowly, it's only relationship between the 2 governments. It's only the diplomatic relations, right? But you remember the phrase, politics is cold, but economics is hot. And we naturally adopted it, you know, because by common sense, we understand that economics is a very important part of a bilateral relationship. So that's how not only the general public, but even the academics had no objection to this phrase, economics is hot, but politics is cold. So in fact, it's not easy to define bilateral relations. So I tend to see any bilateral relations as a bundle of relationships on different aspects. So there is, of course, the security aspect of the relationship. It's very important now between Japan and China. And I combine it with the international environment. Why? Because in our part of the world, the America factor is very important. Yeah? So what kind of policy the United States takes vis-a-vis China against Japan plays a role in defining Japan-China relations. And of course, our security ties with America is very strong. We have a security treaty, and therefore I combine the international environment and security sovereignty issues together. Usually that should be enough, but in Northeast Asia, I find people's perceptions, people's emotions, people's identity a very important factor in defining the relationship. And you find arrows between these factor areas, which means that there is interaction between these areas, right? If the people's emotions against the other side is very bad, the politicians must take that into account. It becomes China or Japan becomes an important domestic political issue. That could affect economic ties also. So this kind of interaction is very important, but it's very hard to gauge. We discussed about emotional diplomacy somewhat today, and we all understand the importance of it, but the difficulty of gauging, measuring our emotions and how they interact with other factor areas is something important, but we have to find better ways to explore these arrows. Okay? And domestic politics, very simply put, as I say here, Japanese prime ministers, whoever he is, has to attend to 2 things. One is they have to stand firm against China's physical challenges. That's what the people want, on the one hand. But on the other hand, people understand, the general public understand that Japan-China relations are important. China is an important country for Japan. Of course, economically, also security-wise, and culturally, you know, we are very close to each other. So if you do a survey, a public survey of what do you think about China, what is your image of China, as I will show you in a minute, today 92.2% of the Japanese say they don't have a good image of China, but almost 70% of the Japanese would answer that Japan-China relations are still important. So you may have noticed that any Japanese prime minister does try to improve or stabilize at least Japan-China relations, especially when a general election is coming up. There's no exception. Everybody acts like that. And on the Chinese side, Japan is also a hot potato politically. A Chinese leader should never be looked at as a weak-kneed leader against Japan. The nationalistic sentiments are very high. So he has to attend to these interests both amongst the leaders in the leadership. The rivals can easily be critical of you if you looked weak against Japan, but the public would not allow that either. So that's the basic situation in China. But there is also the vertical axis. If I had time, I could go a little deep into the current situation of Chinese vertical domestic politics, but it's the relationship between the party and the masses. Now, because of the failure of the zero COVID policy, people's trust in the regime, people's trust in Xi Jinping has really dropped very dramatically. And how that is going to affect China's foreign policy, China's external policy, including security policy, China's Japan policy, is something that we are a lot worried about at the moment. Okay, but if there are questions, we can discuss that. Economic interests, usually a factor that plays very positively in Japan-China relations. You know that China is our largest trading partner even today. And there's been surveys of Japanese firms in China. This is just a little bit of the results that I'm showing you here. In late 2023 last year, the survey conducted then showed that over half of the Japanese firms in China answered that they will invest more or the same amount as they did in 2022 in 2023. So the big interest in the potential of the Chinese market has never gone away. I think it's the same in Nordic countries, it's the same in the United States, it's the same in Germany, for example. And for China, the relative importance of Japan has decreased since the promotion of reform and opening up policies, because in the 1980s, of course, there were some exceptions in America and Europe, but many Americans and Europeans didn't really discover, they hadn't discovered China's potential yet. But the Japanese knew, because they had experience in dealing with China and dealing with the Chinese since the war days. So they went into China in a big way, and so they were the forerunner. But after 1992, especially after 2001, when China joined the WTO, a lot of capital, technology people flew into China from Europe and America, North America, and therefore the importance of Japan, relatively speaking, went down. However, still, it's a very important trading partner in the sense that a lot of key components of machinery come from Japan, and especially in certain localities, Japanese investments are very important. So today, a lot of the local governments in China still send a lot of delegations to lure investment from Japanese firms. Okay, so this is a chart showing how Japan's trade with China and the US compares. In 2004, the trade with China surpassed the amount of our trade with the United States. Last year, China trade went down by 10% or so, and US trade with the US didn't go down so much, so the gap has narrowed, but still China is our largest trading partner. And this is the Genron NPO and their counterpart, the International Publishing Group of China. They conduct this annual survey. I'm sure many of you are aware of the results, and as I told you, 92.2%, that's the top red line, showing the percentage of Japanese with a negative image of China. It went up so high last year, I think because of the treated water issue that played a big role. But the green line, that's second from the bottom, shows the percentage of the Chinese people who have a good image of Japan. So when they hit the bottom in 2013, the newest survey after the clash over the Senkakus, only 5% had a good image, but it went up and up and up until in 2020 it sort of leveled. 2021 it went down, but started to grow again in 2022 and 2023. And many of you will be aware that this coincides with the increase and the decrease of people coming from China. Increase because of tourism, because of more business, and the decrease because of COVID. You know, this graph only shows up to 2019, but in 2020, much less people came. 2021, hardly anybody came, and I would say that that's reflected in the green curve that you find. So why is it like that? Because, you know, the Chinese people, when they actually come to Japan, they see for themselves, they feel for themselves what Japan is really like. And they realize that what they had been taught back home, it's not quite true. The true Japan is something different. Of course, there are 1.4 billion Chinese. So, however, I think this clearly shows that still it's important that people-to-people exchange matters, and now with the SNS and so on and so forth, they can send messages back home, and it counts. The reason why the Japanese don't have a good image, one very basic and most important reason, according to the public survey, is the senkaku issue. And the real physical pressure that the Japanese are now feeling, you know, the threat coming from China, you can understand by the increase in the number of Chinese vessels coming to the contiguous zones. And the equipment that they have is getting better and better, you know. And the size of the boats that they send is getting bigger and bigger. And always behind the Coast Guard vessels, there are the naval vessels. So you see this salami slicing type of gradual increase of physical pressure, and their attempt to change the status quo by physical force is real. And we have to cope with that. We have to deal with that. Okay, this is the defense budget. You know about the plan to increase the Japanese defense budget, and the Chinese are making a big fuss about that. But if you see this, the yellow the yellow bar shows the amount of the Japanese defense budget. So even if we double it in the next 5 years, the Chinese will increase theirs much faster. So the gap is going to be bigger in the next 5 years, even though if we double our defense budget. But still, the Japanese government feels that it's needed, that we do our best so that, you know, we do our best to balance as well as we can, so that we will not tempt the adventurous in China to make any moves. But at the same time, of course, we will try to reinforce our alliance networks with the United States and others to cope with China's rise in a realistic way. But there are other means that we should resort to at the same time. I will come back to that. And, you know, this is a footnote. This is about China. Xi Jinping's intentions are expanding. You know, in his internal speeches, he said things like this: it is our important strategic decision to become a sea power as well as a land power, because one sentence before that was, all the dominant powers in the world are both sea powers and land powers. So we have been a land power, but we must become a sea power too. That's his thinking. And that's why he is building up his navy, and he's trying to make further maritime advancement. He's very concerned about the first island chain, and geographically, the fact that they are sort of seized by others, according to them, that you can see by this famous map. If you looked if you looked east from China, you can see that they are contained by the first island chain. Yeah? But the other thing he started to say recently, you know, he used to say to the Americans, the Pacific is big enough to accommodate two big powers, the United States and China. Yeah? But last November, when he met President Biden, he used a new phrase. He said, the globe is big enough for the US and China to coexist. So you can see that gradually, with the rise in national power, China's intentions are growing. So we cannot judge China by the way we judged China 40 years ago. Yeah? On the international environment front, US-China contest is intensifying. We all know about that. For Japan, it's a double-edged sword, as it were, since we need the US to stay We need to reinforce our alliance with the United States, that's true. But on the other hand, the certain policies, economic security policies that the United States has been adopting hurt our economic interests. So this is the situation I think we are all experiencing, and we are all thinking of ways that what's the best way to deal with that kind of situation. So under this, under these conditions, Japan has had to adopt a two-pronged approach, what I would call a two-pronged approach. That is, we just cannot avoid competing with China unless China changes their policy, you know. So that's what we do on the one hand, but on the other, we do cooperate with China a lot, every day, economically, in terms of non-traditional security. When COVID happened, we cooperate. You know, when there's a natural disaster, we help each other. So all the cooperation continues. So it's a very contradictory situation. If you are a defense expert, you would shout at the business people saying, stop cooperation. You know? If you cooperated, you're making the other side more powerful. What are you doing? But if you talk to the business people, they'll say, what are you talking about? If we stop cooperation, what's going to happen to our economy? Do you think we can still compete? Okay, what do you think? Which side is correct? Both sides are correct, right? Both sides are correct. So this is the contradictory situation that we are living in, and we have to have the resilience to walk the middle line, but that's not easy. That's not easy at all. Since competition will intensify, yeah, unless China changes its policy. But cooperation is likely to deepen, except in certain areas, high tech, you know, there's going to be decoupling, perhaps, but in other areas, cooperation will go deeper. Automobile companies will keep on investing, other industries too. So the leader in any country will have to have a very solid and broad power base to be able to walk the middle way. He or she has to be able to persuade both the hawks and the doves. Yes? Abe could do it. Kishida? Not really. The next leader of China? I have doubts. But how about in your countries? But it's the same in China. China has to adopt this two-pronged approach. They have to compete with us, but cooperate with us at the same time. And can we all stand this contradictory situation? I think we are tested now. This is a big challenge that we are facing now. So the strategic patience must continue, what I call a strategic patience, but people can ask for how long? And my answer is until China changes. But many people think China is not going to change. That's the mainstream thinking in the United States these days, right? That's why they have changed their engagement policy to have a very tough stance against China. But as a China expert, oh, come on. Hasn't China changed in the past 40 years? Well, under Xi Jinping, okay, it's gone the other way. But history is a zigzag. You know, you have to be patient. And my thinking is, look at how much the Chinese people have changed. Yeah? And we cannot shape China. It's only the Chinese that can change China, shape China. So let us help the Chinese change themselves and be a more stable, peaceful, non-aggressive nation. That's our common target. Finally, I'm very concerned about the perception gap that exists between Japan and China. I showed you the example of the senkakus, but there's a huge perception gap between us and them about what's happening in the world, what's happening between Japan and China, what's happening between China and Europe. So we need to narrow this perception gap. How do we do it? We have to narrow the information gap. Our perceptions are formed by the information that we have daily access to. Human beings are very weak. You know, we are easily affected by the daily information that we get. So how are we going to narrow this information gap? Not easy, people-to-people exchange. Yeah, I think that's the only way, perhaps. But let's work on it so that we can maintain peace. We have to mobilize all sorts of means. I am an area studies person, so I don't believe in a certain specific international relations school thinking. But I think we need some realistic means. We need some liberal means also. We need the constructivist means. Mobilize everything. We need that to maintain peace. Thank you very much.